For the 3,000 victims of the attacks now known as 9/11. And today, the New York Times publishes new images that quickly bring back the horror of that moment. They come from a construction worker who taped the World Trade Center attacks but never made his video public. This morning, we'll give you an exclusive look at the video and examine the global war on terror provoked by that strike, a war the president will address in a primetime speech tonight.
This week, until now, it has been a go-it-alone policy.
We will stay on the offensive, and this nation will prevail.
As the president prepares to address the nation, we'll talk to the man who was supposed to convince the UN to join a fight that was begun without it.
We hope with this new resolution, more nations will be encouraged to become a part of this noble effort.
And to the senator who has grave doubts about where all this is headed.
The foundation of our post-war policy was built on a quicksand of false assumptions. And the result has been chaos with the Iraqi people and the continuing mortal danger for our troops.
From ABC News in Washington, This Week with George Stephanopolous.
We begin with these extraordinary new pictures of the World Trade Center attacks, the only video we know of that recorded both planes on impact. It was taken by Pavel Halava, an immigrant worker from the Czech Republic who was making a video postcard of New York City to send home. It's 1 minute before the attack. As the SUV Halava was riding in entered the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, he fixed for a few seconds on the World Trade Center. What he didn't realize until weeks later was that his camera had actually captured the first plane going into the North Tower. You can see American Flight 11 as it approaches and hits. The second attack was impossible to miss.
Mike, stop.
The car, which was being driven by Halava's boss, Mike Cohen, had just emerged from the tunnel at the foot of the World Trade Center. It was so close that the camera's microphone was able to pick up the engines of United Flight 175 in the final seconds before impact. A remarkable piece of video. And I should point out that it was provided to ABC News for free. And joining us now to discuss the war that began that day, Secretary of State Colin Powell. Welcome.
Good morning,
video,
George.
Isn't it?
Some video, amazing, and reminds us once again the nature of the terrorists that we are fighting. On September 11th this week coming up, we will once again remember those who lost their lives, and I hope that all of us will rededicate ourselves to going after these terrorists and make sure that we remove terrorism as a threat to the civilized world.
Tonight, the president's going to address the war that began that day. It's now being fought on several fronts around the world, two major battles in Afghanistan and Iraq. Is it now time for, as Senator John Warner and others have suggested, a mid-course correction in the war?
I don't think so. I think we have a good strategy, and we're executing that strategy. Let's look at the results. I heard Senator Kennedy in your opening talk about the results. The results are two despotic regimes are gone, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein. The results of that, there will be no mass graves created of the kind that Don Rumsfeld visited in Iraq earlier this week. Another result is that children are going back to school in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, the hospitals are open. The electricity is coming back on. The sewage system is being repaired. All of the infrastructure that was destroyed systematically over the years of misrule by the Taliban and by Saddam Hussein in Iraq being restored by the international community under the leadership of the United States. Both countries' national armies are being recreated so that they can assume responsibility for their own security, their own police function. Political systems are being created. Afghanistan a little further along than Iraq. But we have a strategy. We know how to go about this. We have done it before in our history. And now we're trying to generate more support from the international community. The result, for example, in Iraq right now, we have a political process underway. A governing council has been formed. They have appointed cabinet ministers. A constitutional process is underway to write a constitution. Free elections will follow from that. And what we have to do is stay the course. Are there still difficulties? Yes. Are terrorists trying to take advantage of this situation? Yes. Are we taking casualties? Regrettably, yes. But we're going to stay the course.
Not everyone agrees that the strategy is sound. In fact, someone who works for you, General Anthony Zinni, a consultant to the State Department, the former head of U.S. Central Command, gave a remarkable speech this week in which he said that you were working on a flawed strategy that he believes is exposing American troops to unnecessary risks. I want to play a portion of what he said and get you to respond.
Where are we, the American people,
if we accept this, if we accept this level of sacrifice without that level of planning. Almost everyone in this room, my contemporaries, our feelings and our sensitivities were forged on the battlefields of Vietnam, where we heard the garbage and the lies, and we saw the sacrifice. We swore never again we would do that. We swore never again we would allow it to happen. And I ask you, is it happening again?
No, it's not happening again. And if you ask General Sanchez, if you ask General Abizaid, if you ask General Petraeus of the 101st Airborne Division, who's doing a tremendous job bringing stability to the northern part of Iraq, you will find a different point of view than that expressed by General Zinni. In the north, things are going well. In the south, things are stabilizing. In the center, in the Sunni Triangle, we're still having some difficulties. But we're not shying away from these difficulties. We will take these problems on and solve them one at a time.
But there was a report, an internal report by the Joint Chiefs of Staff released this week to the Washington Times that said that there wasn't proper planning for the post-war effort, and perhaps that the rush to war in March prevented proper planning.
Well, be that as it may, and I'll let the Joint Chiefs of Staff speak for their own report, the point is that we now understand the nature of the task that is before us. We know that there remain Fedayeen and Ba'athist elements. We know that there are terrorists who are coming into Iraq. And we will now identify this enemy, and we will root them out. And that's what the President's going to talk to tonight. He's going to talk to the fact that what we have to do is establish security and go after these terrorists, and then we have to involve more of the international community, more beyond that's already involved. I mean, 29 nations are standing alongside us in Iraq now, contributing something like 20,000 troops. We have two multinational divisions there, one led by the Brits and one led by the Poles, so we're not there alone. But the President will call for more involvement on the part of the international community.
Not there alone, but the United States has not been able to get major troops from India, from Pakistan, from Turkey, from other nations. And the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave an interview to Time magazine today where he said perhaps a little more patience at the front end would have helped build this coalition and give more time for this planning. Looking back, do you think it would have been wise to wait just a little bit longer to give more of a chance to build a coalition?
A little bit longer for what? I mean, we saw what Saddam Hussein was doing. We think that the action we took was appropriate, and I think the results demonstrate that it was the right thing to do. That regime is gone, and we now see the horrible nature of that regime as the mass graves are uncovered, as we see all of the weapons and weaponry and the destruction that he has caused throughout that country. So we have no apologies for what we did. And we are working with the Turks and the Indians and the Pakistanis and others to see whether they are able to make a contribution.
Are they ready to do that?
Let's not dismiss the contribution that has been made by Spain and Poland and the Czech Republic and so many other nations that are there. So let's not say, well, we don't have this country and that country and ignore the fact that we do have 29 countries and we do have a solid coalition that's working. Now, the resolution that the United States will be working with our Security Council colleagues on getting through over the next couple of weeks, I would say, will give a broader mandate for the international community to come together. Talks about a multinational force. It talks about a political process to return sovereignty to the Iraqi people. You can't do it overnight. You have to have institutions. You have to have a constitution. You have to have elections before you can turn everything over to the Iraqi people. And all of that is in train. Ambassador Bremer gave a speech to the Iraqi people on Friday where he laid this all out, 7 straight steps leading to sovereignty. And so we are as anxious as anyone is to return sovereignty to the Iraqi people, but it has to be done in the right way, responsible way.
France and Germany have said to sign on to that resolution. They seem to have two big concerns. One, they want that timetable speeded up, and secondly, they want some sort of process where the UN or another international body shares power in the political administration with Ambassador Bremer. Is the United States prepared to accept that?
I want to see what it is that the French and the Germans, but principally the French, really mean by this. It is one thing to toss out statements and slogans. It's quite something else to operationalize those statements and slogans in a resolution, and they will be working with the French.
Are they doing more than tossing out statements and slogans now, do you believe?
Right now, I have heard the logic of occupation must give way to the logic of sovereignty. They say that over and over. We agree that sovereignty is what we are all for. And I don't think there's any disagreement among any of the members of the Security Council that we want to turn over Iraq to the Iraqi people as soon as possible. But it has to be done in a responsible way. And we do have a logic of sovereignty. That's what the President said from the very beginning. We are doing this for the Iraqi people, not for the benefit of the United States, but the benefit of the Iraqi people, the benefit of the region, the benefit of the world, and as part of our global war against terrorism. But it has to be done in a sensible way, in a correct way. Ambassador Bremer is working with Iraqi officials to come forward with a plan. And so the plan should come from the Iraqi Governing Council, not from the United States, not from France, not from Germany or any other member of the Security Council. And the resolution asks for the Iraqi Governing Council, which is now up and functioning, to provide a plan in coordination with Ambassador Bremer, in coordination with the Secretary General's representative, to describe the plan that they would like to execute and the timetable they believe it is executable in.
In the meantime, the security situation is getting worse. I want to show some figures of the wounded in action over the last several months. It shows for May, June, and July, there were 277 wounded in action, about 3 a day. In August, 297, 10 per day. That trend line is getting worse. In response, the British are expected to announce tomorrow they're sending 3,000 more troops to Iraq. Why not send more American troops to bolster security in the short run until these negotiations are done?
The commanders believe that the number of troops that are there now are adequate to the task that they have for those troops. And the focus of our energy right now is raising up Iraqi security forces, an army, police force, border patrols, these kinds of forces. So I go with the recommendation of our commanders and the judgment of our commanders that the number of U.S. troops there now is adequate. And our energy should be on raising up Iraqi indigenous forces to take over these security responsibilities.
On weapons,
if we can get Iraqis trained and equipped quickly to start doing these guard functions and to go to places that are relatively stable and keep them stable, then that's what we should do and not send more U.S. troops to stand around these places.
On weapons of mass destruction, David Kaye's survey team is expected to report in the next couple of weeks. The Los Angeles Times reported last week that they have found no evidence of any weapons, biological or chemical weapons, being produced since 1991. Are you still confident that actual weapons of mass destruction will be found in Iraq?
I'm still confident that there were weapons of mass destruction and programs to develop weapons of mass destruction. And we'll wait and see what David Kaye says in his first report.
When were they destroyed then?
Well, I don't know that they were destroyed. They were at the time that we took the action that we took. And I'm not saying they're not there now. We will wait and see what Dr. Kaye reports.
Let me now turn to the Palestinian situation. Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas resigned yesterday. He said today that resignation is final. And when he talked to the Palestinian parliament, he had some very harsh words for the United States. He said the United States did not do enough to support him.
Well, we did everything we could to support him. The major challenge we had, and he had, was that Hamas, a terrorist organization, would not stop its terrorist activities. And the Palestinian Legislative Council and Mr. Arafat and other authorities within the Palestinian community did not give Mr. Abbas the resources that he needed in order to go after Hamas. We have to change that, or else we will not find progress ahead of us.
Associates of Mr. Abbas said that President Arafat betrayed him. Do you agree with that?
I'm not going to characterize one person's statement. What I would say is that Mr. Arafat did not put under Mr. Abbas the security forces that were under Mr. Arafat's control. As a result, Mr. Abbas did not have the kind of political support that the Palestinian people should have given to him, and he did not have access to all the security forces that might have allowed him to take on this terrorist organization. Now, I'm very pleased that yesterday the European Union realized finally that they could not deal with Hamas any longer, could not separate Hamas's militant wing from its political wing, and they made a political decision over the weekend to consider all of Hamas a terrorist organization. We will not see a way forward in the presence of continued terrorist activity on the part of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other similar organizations. And whoever becomes the new Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority must have under his control all of the security forces, and he must have a solid political mandate from the PLC in order to go after these terrorist organizations. We started to move out in a rather good way at the beginning of the roadmap after Aqaba. Cities were turned over, Bethlehem. Gaza Strip was turned over. There was a ceasefire for a while, but Hamas retained the capability to get out of that ceasefire anytime they chose to do so, and they chose to do so. And as a result, we went right back into this cycle of strike and counterstrike, and the end result is that the dreams of the Palestinian people have been deferred once again.
Given
now, if I just may, George, it is now important over the next several days for the Palestinian Legislative Council to make a judgment as to who will lead the Palestinian Authority as prime minister, and will that person have the political authority and the resources to deal with terrorism. They have to answer this question yes, if they want to keep moving toward that state that we all hope for, that is part of the president's vision.
But won't whoever that person is be the hand-picked person of Yasser Arafat, and that could perpetuate the problem we've seen?
It remains to be seen. Whoever that person is, hand-picked, not hand-picked, whether it is somebody who reflects the will of most of the Palestinian leaders, that person has to have political authority and the determination to go after terrorism. And whoever that person is remains to be determined. If that person does not make a solid commitment to follow the roadmap, go after terrorism, and stop these terrorist attacks, then it's not clear that we'll be able to move forward. It has to start with the end of terrorist attack by organizations such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Given what you say about Hamas, do you think it's appropriate for Israel to continue its policy of assassinating Hamas leaders?
We think that this, we've always been opposed to this policy, and we have cautioned our Israeli friends that as they do these kinds of self-defense activities, they have to consider the long-range consequences. To kill one Hamas leader, but to wound 9 children or 10 children in the course of this, who will grow up to become Hamas leaders or Hamas killers later, they have to consider the long-term consequences of this policy.
The Israeli foreign minister this morning said it's time now, finally, for Israel to expel Yasser Arafat. The United States has been opposed to this, warned Prime Minister Ariel Sharon not to expel Arafat. Is that still the United States policy?
Yes, and I don't know what the Israeli cabinet or the Prime Minister think with respect to the foreign minister's statement.
So, but you do not want Prime Minister Sharon to expel Arafat?
I don't think there's any purpose in doing it right now. What purpose would it serve? To give him a broader stage to operate from outside of the region?
Let me now turn to North Korea. Former President Jimmy Carter 2 days ago called the standoff on the Korean Peninsula the greatest threat to global peace. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't think it's the greatest threat to global peace. I think terrorism is the greatest threat to global peace. North Korea is a particular problem, and we're hard at work on that problem. When we first discovered the problem last fall, and the problem in a nutshell was that North Korea, having been capped with one of its nuclear weapons program, everybody said that's terrific. The agreed framework stopped that North Korean nuclear program. They were working on another one. We found it and called them to it, called attention to it, said, what about this? And they said, we're doing it. We're a nuclear weapon-holding country. We told previous administration 10 years ago. They didn't believe us. We're telling you now. Well, we have to accept them at their word. What we did, rather than just running into a negotiation and once again having them try to get something out of us for promises that weren't kept last time to be repeated now, we said this is a problem for the international community, and especially for North Korea's neighbors. Everybody said it'll never work. They will never come into a meeting with anyone except the United States. Well, we have succeeded in bringing all of the neighbors to the table, China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, North Korea, and the United States. And we had, I think, a very good meeting a week and a half ago with all of these 6 parties, with all 6 parties saying we want to see a denuclearized Korean peninsula, to include the North Koreans saying that. Now what we have to do is to find a way forward in order to make sure that this time, if the North Koreans are serious, and what they're asking for are security assurances. The President has said repeatedly, we're not going to invade you, have no hostile intent. We retain all of our options, but we can find a peaceful solution to this problem.
As part of that way forward, are you prepared to provide aid and other incentives in a step-by-step process in return for a step-by-step build-down of the Korean nuclear
We haven't
program?
gotten that far. Right now, the first challenge before us is to get North Korea to say clearly that they are prepared to give up entirely their nuclear weapons program in a verifiable manner. And we know that they want from us, the only thing they've asked for from us, the United States, is some sort of security assurance. That's the first step. Other items with respect to economic assistance, which they've asked other countries for, or other things that might be done as we move down this road, that's not on the table right now. Step 1 is an end to their program in a verifiable way, their commitment to an end to that program. It won't be ended in one meeting or with one statement. It's going to take time. And we will have to make a judgment with our allies over the next few weeks before the next meeting as to what kind of security assurance would be satisfactory for all of us to provide to the North Koreans so that they would feel comfortable in taking this step.
Secretary Powell, thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
When we come back, a Democratic response from Senator Edward Kennedy.
This week with George Stephanopolous, brought to you by IBM, taking business to the next level with e-business on demand.
Our current strategy in Iraq is a successful one. I think the administration has to abandon its my way or the highway attitude. It has to recognize, and I'm beginning that it has to go to the United Nations and alter and change its policies. For the Secretary to suggest that we have a successful policy in Iraq flies in the face of the fact that we're seeing Americans killed daily in Iraq. We've seen the bombing of the Jordanian embassy, the blowing up the United Nations headquarters, the bombing of the mosque in Najaf. We have seen the blowing up of the local police station, the continued savaging of the local resources. We don't have an exit strategy in Iraq. It's difficult for me to understand how you can have a successful policy going in Iraq when we don't even have a successful exit strategy.
But sir,
and we are about to, now we hopefully we see an administration that's going to the United Nations. They should have stayed with the United Nations in the first place. All of us understand that Saddam Hussein had to be removed, but I believe that the best opportunities were to remove him through a United Nations process. When we see today that Iraq is a breeding ground of the various terrorists that Secretary Powell says that is our objective to trying to free the world of, I just don't see how this is a successful policy. I welcome the fact that the administration effectively is going to abandon its policy, but I still, in listening carefully to the Secretary Powell, I do not believe that they've made the judgment that the United Nations is going to have full authority and full control in terms of the civil aspect of the development there.
Well, excuse me,
they
sir.
have had.
Excuse me, sir. What more would you have them do? The president seems to be doing now exactly what Democrats have asked him to do. He's going to the United Nations. He's coming to the country, speaking to the country tonight, going to outline the costs.
Well, first of all, I know it's going to be a difficult speech tonight, because in order to be a successful speech, the American people are going to be looking for not just words, but they're going to be looking for actions, and they're going to have to see a recognition that the policy that we have in Iraq has been a failed policy. Now, by going to the United Nations, as the Secretary acknowledged, in order for the United Nations to really become engaged, it's going to have to be able to appoint the civil authority there, as they have done in East Timor, as they did in Kosovo and Bosnia. That has not been acceptable. You heard what the Secretary said at this time. If we're expecting the United Nations to get engaged in the contribution session that we're going to have in October, and to make contribution to help provide some relief for the American taxpayers, with also troops to follow to try and provide some relief for the American troops, they're going to have to be totally engaged. In other words, what we have to do perhaps is let Secretary Powell do the negotiation and ask Secretary Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz to stand aside. That's what's going to be necessary if we're going to have a successful. What isn't important is just having a resolution at the United Nations. We have to have the right resolution.
You said that Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz should step aside. Earlier this week, one of your colleagues in the House, David Obey, a senior Democrat, suggested that Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld should resign. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think their policy should resign. I'm interested in the policy, because if we're going to retain the policy and retain the strategy, we're going to see the continued drift and the run-amok policy that we have over there in Iraq. That's what I'm interested in. That's what has to be altered. That's what has to be changed. Now, hopefully, with the movement towards the United Nations, we're going to see this change. And hopefully tonight that the President is going to recognize that the failed policies of the past, because he is going to be speaking not only to the American people, but he's going to be speaking to the world community. They'll be listening very carefully. Those countries that we want to engage in the United Nations are going to be listening carefully to the United States President tonight. And he's going to have to give them the assurance that they are going to be carefully engaged. Then I believe that we're going to be able to reduce the Americanization of the occupation. We're going to be able to bring in the Muslim troops that are going to be able to help us, bring in the Indian troops, bring in the Pakistani troops, bring in the Egyptian troops, and bring in the others that can provide some relief for our troops so they will be able to come home honorably. That's
Tonight
what this is really all about.
Excuse me, sir. Tonight he's also going to be speaking to the Congress, and the president is expected to outline how much this is all going to cost. He's going to be making a request for money. Will you be seeking to put any kinds of conditions on those funds before they go?
Oh, absolutely. We need a plan for this. We shouldn't just be writing a blank check for this administration to continue to squander this money over there. We need to know, we need to have a plan. We need to have a plan what's happening at the United Nations, when we're going to expect those troops that are going to come to the United States to augment and effectively supplement and perhaps replace American troops so American troops can come home. We have to have a strategy in terms of the reconstruction, and we have to have an exit strategy. That ought to be a plan. That's not an issue of partisanship. That's an issue of national security. We need a plan. We haven't got a plan. The administration is proceeding day by day. It's a makeshift operation over there. One day it's this plan, it's another day another plan. And the people that are suffering are the American servicemen. The fact that we've got a bankrupt policy over there is being paid for by the American servicemen and women. That has to change. That has to alter. And I will certainly be a strong supporter of the effort by the administration to go to the United Nations and have a really important UN resolution that will engage the world community, to offset the burden on American taxpayers, and then we will see the follow-on for troops, which is so necessary for help and assistance to the American fighting men and women in Iraq.
Sir, let me turn to another issue that you've been right in the middle of this summer, prescription drug legislation for Medicare. You supported the legislation that passed the Senate, but there are big differences between that legislation and the legislation that passed the House. What are the odds that those differences can be bridged this fall, that you can pass legislation that will get your support and be signed by the President?
Well, I'm very hopeful we can have a successful negotiation, but the only way we will is if the President is going to become involved. If the President's going to become involved and we're going to have a bipartisan resolution to the conference, we will have a down payment on the commitment of the American government, which we did in 1965 when we passed the Medicare, where we took care of hospitalizations and physician fees. The other third part of that stool of prescription drugs, and we will have a down payment for our senior citizens. It is not the bill I would have drafted. It won't have all the things in it that I would like to have, but we will get a down payment on it and we will be able to build in it. If the Republicans insist on dismantling Medicare by their premium support provision that is included in the House bill, I will fight with every bit of energy that I have against that particular proposal, because that'll be the dismantling of the Medicare system, which Republicans have traditionally and historically wanted to undertake. If the President comes to grips with this conference, we can get a bill, and it'll be a down payment, and it'll make a difference. Secondly, we have to do something about the cost of prescription drugs. That is equally important. We have some provisions in the Senate bill that can make some difference on it. It will not go as far as we would like to, but that is going to be a continuing effort on all of our parts, because that's an essential part of this whole effort on prescription drugs, access and cost.
The House legislation also calls for means testing, that wealthier Medicare recipients will have to pay more for the prescription drug benefit. Will you accept moving in the House direction on that?
Well, I'm basically opposed to the means test, because I think we understand that Social Security, Medicare are basically not meant to be welfare systems or poverty programs. Basically, this is a red herring about the means test, because Donald Trump and Bill Gates pay in so much more, and 3/4 of Part B of the Medicare paid by general revenues. So Don Trump and Bill Gates have paid 10,000 times as much as they would ever get out of a Medicare prescription drug program. So it's basically a red herring, but there's a principle that's involved. The fact is, we understand that there has to be an engagement, and we're not going to get everything we want. They're not going to get everything they want. We're ready to try and find constructive compromises. That's what we are interested in. I know Max Baucus is interested. I know Chuck Grassley. They've been the leaders in this in the Senate of the United States. Tom Daschle has been strongly committed. they have been a strong supporter of trying to get legislation, and they are the ones that are really our leaders in the United States Senate.
Finally, sir, your family member, Arnold Schwarzenegger, has been all over the news this week, the last few weeks in the California recall. I want to show you and our viewers something he said to Chris Matthews about his time up in Hyannisport and get you to respond.
If you let me talk, then I can tell you. First of all, let me tell you that the Kennedys have probably tried for 26 years now to make me into a Democrat. It didn't work.
That doesn't say much for the persuasive powers of the Kennedy clan.
No, I wish we'd been successful. Look, I love Maria. I'm very close to her. She's one of, I have a lot of special nieces and nephews, and she's certainly one of them. And I like Arnold. But basically, a recall petition, I believe, runs contrary to really what our founding fathers really expected, and that is that we were going to have elections and that we were going to have 2 years, 4 years for the presidency, 6 years for the Senate. I think we ought to maintain our basic kinds of structures of checks and balances, and I'm opposed to the recall petition.
So will you go to California and campaign against the recall?
I'll look forward to seeing Arnold the next time he comes up to the Cape, and I'll keep trying.
But not in California. You're not going to campaign against the recall?
No, I don't expect so, and I don't think they expect me to.
Okay, Senator Kennedy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Roundtable's coming right up. Time now for the Roundtable. Joining us as always, George Will, Michelle Martin, and from the Wall Street Journal, Paul Gigot. Welcome.
Thanks, George.
Well, George, you heard two very different points of view there. Secretary of State Powell, no mid-course corrections, stay the course. Senator Keddy says it's a failed strategy, has to be changed.
Well, the Powell position is the Howard Dean position, is the John Kerry position. It's every Democratic candidate's position is we're there, we have to go through. The only way out is through. The Kennedy position is there's chaos in Iraq. That's certainly true. The question is the chaos we now have worse than the tyranny that existed there? Who speaks for the Iraqi people in this? Second, he said American forces are in mortal danger. Indeed, they are. Hard truth is that's what American forces are for, is to go in harm's way in the national interest. So it's almost as though the force from 9/11 blew the Democratic Party back to 1972 to a kind of McGovern position, come home America, at least as expressed by Mr. Kennedy. But the other Democrats running for the presidency understand there's no way back other than succeeding.
I'm not quite sure I understand your point. The Democratic Party, the leader of any party is whoever the president is at any given time. I mean, everybody else is a committee. And so I think that you saw, this is a hard problem, and people have different solutions to it, but the core of the Democratic Party is expressed by the people running for president, including a number of the people who are generally considered to be, left of center, rightly or wrongly, by the general population, is the same as the president's, essentially, which is that the cost of failure is far higher than the cost of continuing.
That is my point.
And so I think...
But look at what the words that Kennedy used. He said we need an exit strategy. That suggests we need a Somalia strategy, a Mogadishu strategy, or a Beirut strategy, or a Saigon strategy. Those are failed strategies. What I think the American public wants to hear from the president tonight is a victory strategy. And that's what the American public are likely to support, because they realize that failure in Iraq, as John Abizaid, who's running things at CENTCOM, has said, if we fail in Iraq, we fail in the war on terror. And I think that's...
how do you get that? I'm sorry, I don't understand your point either, which seems to me that what Senator Kennedy said is very little different from what General Zinni said, which is that there seemed to have been a lot of planning in the war phase and not enough discussion about the post-war phase and the reconstruction phase. Doesn't strike me as saying that, we need to sort of pull up the tents and pull out right now, that there needs to be a coherent plan for turning over governance to the Iraqi people. I mean, I think that's what the president's going to talk about tonight, but I don't see that I don't see where Somalia comes into this.
I certainly would agree with that, that we need that kind of coherent plan. But his words were exit strategy. And when people in the Middle East hear that, they hear a lack of resolve. They hear the Americans are looking for a way out. And when I was in Iraq in July, what I heard is not fear that we will stay too long, but fear that we will leave too soon before we've done the job adequately. And that's the problem with the message the president sent with going to the UN, or the danger. I mean, the strategy of going to the UN makes sense, can make sense strategically if you get the right kind of troops. But if they hear in the Mideast and in Iraq that we're willing to leave, that we're looking for a way out, I think that undermines our
Very
ability
few
to
people are
succeed.
suggesting that, with the exception, I think, probably of Congressman Dennis Kucinich in the debate the other night. But, George, the question is, how much is the United States going to have to give up to get these troops from India, from Pakistan, from Turkey? I don't think anyone expects France and Germany to really send troops. And is it worth it, for example, to share control of the coalition authority with a European, with someone from the United Nations?
I think it is, because that is sharing control over the political evolution of Iraq, which is not our fundamental goal in being there. Our fundamental goal in being there was to make Iraq safe for the world, not a model of democracy. That's optional, and the UN can help there. What is non-negotiable, we've made clear, is that American soldiers will serve under an American command structure. That's the
And it seems
bottom line.
non-controversial at this
That's right.
point.
And there are other things that France and Germany can do. For example, they can afford the Iraqi Governing Council full diplomatic recognition. They can sort of take other steps to bring them back into the community of nations, so to speak. And I think that that's something that the administration is working on right
Paul,
now.
I couldn't help but notice at least some submerged irritation. Secretary Powell, when he was talking about the French, talking about slogans, or maybe it wasn't so.
You think so?
So submerged. I mean, can this alliance or relationship be put back together, and do you think France and the United States will be together here at the end?
I suspect that the administration would not have gone into this if they thought the French would veto again. I think they think that they'll be able to get at least an abstention at the United Nations. And already the Russians and the Chinese, for example, seem to be more cooperative. I think that the French do not want to be out there alone with only the Germans, who don't have a vote in the Security Council on their side.
And they probably want to get this done before President Chirac comes here in a couple of weeks. Let me turn now to these remarkable events in the Middle East over the weekend. Prime Minister Abbas of the Palestinians does resign. He says this morning it is for good. And Secretary Powell hasn't given up, though, on the roadmap, saying now the test is for the Palestinians again, George, to come up with a leader who will take control of the security apparatus. Is that possible with Yasser Arafat in place?
Of course not. And that was what was peculiar about the Secretary's response to you. He said, no, Arafat should not be expelled. But the problem, what is destroying the roadmap, is Hamas. And what is making Hamas that powerful is that no other person can control the security forces but Arafat, and Arafat won't use them against Hamas. So he's saying keep Arafat, who, by the logic of Powell's answer, is the problem.
It was a curious answer, but it also, the only way it makes sense to me is to say that anyone, if Arafat is expelled, that anyone who then is selected for that position immediately is in the same position that Abbas was in, which is completely untenable, that he's immediately seen as suspect, a tool of the U.S. and the Israelis. So perhaps that to me is the only way that makes sense, is for him to say, we can't hug anybody. The U.S. can't hug anybody in that region, because anybody that the U.S. sort of recognizes as being pro-American or pro-Israeli is going to have the legs cut out from under him.
The argument for not expelling Arafat is that he has that it's better if the Palestinians do that themselves, that they have to settle this internally, perhaps with a civil war. And Abbas resigned because he did not have control of the security forces. He was not willing to crack down on
But
Hamas.
well, not willing, but he also wasn't able, and that seems to be a fool's mission. I mean, I think Abbas's popularity in the last poll, take it for what it's worth, was 1.7%. In the last Palestinian poll. Arafat is a hero again.
That's certainly within the margin of error.
I would think so. So how can you possibly get any new leader who's going to have more power than Abbas had in the last few weeks?
If the Palestinians aren't willing to come up with those leaders, then I don't think the United States position can be to force Israel to try to make a peace with people who don't want a peace.
How do the Palestinian people come up with a new leader when the current leader controls a police state apparatus and runs, in effect, a corrupt thugocracy? The Palestinian people have been so badly led. Their leaders supported the Germans in World War I, the Germans in World War II, Stalin in the Cold War, Iraq in the Gulf War. They're always wrong. And if we wait for the Palestinian leaders to produce people to produce proper leadership, we'll wait forever.
Can we impose one on them, George?
We cannot. We can do what the Israelis are doing, which is build a wall.
Well, how about kill Hamas?
Yes.
We could do that as well. Let them do that without
And
putting
Secretary
pressure on
Powell seemed to be opposed to that policy again this morning. He said no, he did not think it was necessarily helpful. I don't think there's any chance, though, that
Well,
the Israelis are going to
assassinating
stop.
leaders and isolating them is different. I mean, he also pointed out that the EU has finally recognized that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which is an important move in isolating them. I mean, George is right. This is a corrupt dictatorship. This is not a to sort of the blame and allow the Palestinians to continue to live in demeaning and degrading conditions because they live under a corrupt dictatorship is morally wrong.
It may be morally wrong, and maybe, I guess everybody says you can't impose a solution on the Palestinians and the Israelis, but although that is being proposed this morning in the Washington Post, the idea that what you would do is the United States would come up with a plan, make all the outlines, go forward and say, bring this directly to the Palestinian and Israeli people, go over the heads of their leaders and see if they would approve it, back it up, of course, with NATO international peacekeeping troops.
It's difficult to go to the heads of people who will kill anybody who would be willing to sign on to a policy like that, which is what you have now within the Palestinian leadership and with Hamas.
And that's the last word today. Thank you all very much. We'll be right back. In his commentary this week, George Will comes out against mixing sport and state.
Once upon a time, there was a theory that the federal government had only limited powers, that some things were none of the government's business. Well, that was long ago. This was last Thursday. Congressional hearings on, I'm not making this up, on college football's system for arranging bowl games. Good grief, how did that become Congress's business? Here's how. It involves, of course, money. Under the Bowl Championship Series, called BCS, there are these 4 major bowl games. Of the 8 lucrative spots available in these games, 6 go automatically to the champions of these 6 major conferences, which leaves openings for just 2 teams from all the other conferences. They understandably resent missing the big paydays that come from participation in the BCS games, and they say, correctly, that under the BCS system, the rich get richer, because the best players go to the 6 big conferences in order to have the best chance of appearing in the big bowl games. The hearing was partly the work of this congressman, Republican Chris Cannon from Utah. He attended Brigham Young University, which is in his district and is in the Mountain West Conference, and is very unhappy.
It is not acceptable in American society to have such a disparity, to create a second class because of a monopolistic relationship.
But the defenders of the current BCS system hired as their lobbyist this man, former Oklahoma Republican Congressman J.C. Watts, who once was a quarterback for the Oklahoma Sooners on 2 national championship teams. Now, let's stipulate that the BCS system is unfair, but so is much of life. And the question remains, should Congress try to right every wrong and level every playing field? These days, every group with a grievance makes it a federal case. It would be a small step back towards sanity if Congress would tell college football, act like grown-ups, solve your own problems.
When we come back, we'll have this week's email, but first, a look at the rising price of gas at the pump. A record 1-week jump in gas prices has prompted President Bush to launch a federal investigation. All this week in Washington, 600 speakers offered testimonials for AmeriCorps, the financially strapped federal program that provides stipends and scholarships to young people in exchange for community service. We received many emails asking about AmeriCorps, including this one from Kristen Hutchins of Florida. With nearly all of the nation's governors, nearly 80 senators, and a majority of Congress supporting emergency funding of AmeriCorps, how can President Bush sit by and do nothing as a vital program he professes to support is being wiped out by his budget? In response, a White House spokesman told us, the president does feel AmeriCorps is an important program and will fight for its expansion by working with Congress in his next budget request. 2 program notes. Thursday morning, September 11th, ABC News will provide live coverage of the observances at Ground Zero, the Pentagon, and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And tonight, President Bush's address to the nation on Iraq and the war on terrorism begins at 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, and 5:30 Pacific. Thanks for sharing part of your Sunday with us. Until next week, that's This Week.